all people know God the Father. All people know God the Father. All people have knowledge of God the Father. Paul, he gives introductory comments, set the stage in the first 17 verses, and then in verse 18, he starts talking about the wrath of God that is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth of God by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God, listen to what it says, is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Then he says in verse 21 there, for although they knew God, fundamental assumption, God has revealed Himself to all men. Everyone on the planet, whether it is the man in the African jungle, Asian village, Eskimo in the forgotten tundra, wherever, all people have knowledge of God the Father. It is clear, sufficient, plain, so that men are without excuse. Fundamental truth, number one. Truth number two, all people reject true knowledge of God. For although they knew God, verse 21 says, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. So God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And this is us, worship created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. They rejected God the Father. And this is the human condition for all of us. Us in this room, people in Africa and in Asia and the Middle East and Australia, we have all rejected God the Father. I remember talking about this question with a group of college students at one point, and one girl asked me, she said, well, what about, and her example was the Aztec Indians, she said. Aztec Indians who did not have the Bible, but they did the best they could with what they had. Maybe they worshiped the sun. They called it the sun god. But that was the best they could with what they had. Isn't that good enough? And I think it's a good question. But the reality is, Paul says very clearly in Romans, absolutely, that is not good enough. That is the core of what we have all done. We have taken created things and worshiped them instead of the Creator. Idolatry is not good enough before the God of the universe. All people reject true knowledge of God, leading to truth number 3. There are no innocent people in the world. You read through Romans 1:18 through 2:16, and you see an indictment of the Gentiles, the heathen, who do not have the law. And you can almost hear the Jewish Christians amening at every line. Until he gets to chapter 2, verse 17, he says, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, and he goes off on them. And then, in chapter 3, verse 9, all the way through verse 20, he gives this stinging indictment where he pulls text after text after text from the Old Testament and says, there is no one righteous, not even one. No one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. So, here's the deal. If you were to ask me, David, what happens to the innocent guy in Africa who has never heard the gospel? He's never heard the gospel. Then my answer to you, based on what I believe the Word of God teaches very clearly, my answer would be that that man undoubtedly goes to heaven. Without question. He will spend eternity in heaven, even though he's never heard the gospel. The only problem is that guy does not exist. What happens to the innocent guy in Africa? It's how this question is most often phrased. The reality is there is not one innocent person in Africa. If they were innocent, they would have no need to hear the gospel. The reason they need to hear the gospel is because at this moment they stand guilty before a holy God. That's why we take the gospel to them. You follow with me there? Like I saw you looking at each other like, this guy's going to get stoned in the chapel. We bias this question toward ourselves and away from the holiness of God at every turn. And we look for opportunities to point to the injustice of God. The reality is every single one of us in this room is guilty before a holy God. Infinitely guilty before a holy God. No innocent people in the world. Leading to truth number 4. All people are condemned for rejecting God. Romans 1:18 through 3:20 has to be one of the most depressing parts of the entire Bible. Depravity on every phrase. And Paul sums it up in chapter 3, verse 19. He says, we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth is silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. No one, Paul says, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Through the law, we become conscious of sin. In other words, we all stand condemned, and our efforts, every good effort we have to overcome our condemnation, sinks us into greater condemnation. Our best effort even condemns us more. Now, it's at this point that we think about a common idea, not just in our culture, I would say in our churches. There's this idea that if people have never heard the gospel, that certainly God would not allow them, or in a more active way, send them to hell. They never heard. So certainly, by nature of the fact that they've not heard, they will not be held accountable, and therefore they'll go to heaven. It's an idea that at the core begins to think that because they've never heard, there's a pass of sorts into heaven. But think about that. If that were true, first of all, it would certainly not, there's no evidence of this in Scripture, but even on a practical level, if they were guaranteed to go to heaven simply by nature of the fact that they have never heard the gospel, then what is the worst thing you and I could do for their eternal state? Take them the gospel. Like, thanks for having Missions Week. We were doing fine, headed to eternity in heaven with God until you and your IMB got here, messed it all up. Stop commissioning. Obviously, that undercuts the entire evangelistic enterprise of the church. Like, even here in our country, you go to a college campus here, and inevitably, you will meet international students who have little, maybe no knowledge of the gospel. Imagine going up to one of them and saying, have you heard of the gospel? Have you heard of Christ? And they look back at you and say, no. Now, if you believe that person is going to heaven precisely because they have never heard, then what would you say to them? Well, somebody tries to tell you, put your fingers in your ears and start yelling really loudly and run away. This misses the whole point.
Se você já acompanha os nossos vídeos e ainda não é inscrito em nosso canal, esteja se inscrevendo. Ative o sininho para receber as notificações de nossas novas postagens. Compartilhe os nossos vídeos com seus amigos e deixe o seu like. Muito obrigado!